Hello and welcome to week 6. Today this week we're going to be talking about group and individual interventions and strategies. And then we'll also talk about resources for training, so where you can look to get more training, as well as looking in the books that you have already. So a question to start us off with is, have you ever seen a problem in your group? So any group that you've been a member of, as you all have varied group experiences. So have you seen a problem in your group but have been unable to get anyone else to do anything about it? Or been frustrated with a group member's lack of follow through and have been unable to address it? So most likely, most of you will be able to say yes to this question in thinking about and in reading some of your responses to group experiences, especially around storming and how you may have experienced the storming phase in different groups. And it sounds like in several of your experiences, you were able to address it somehow. And in others, it sounds like, especially in group projects and things like that, sometimes there has been one person that hasn't followed through, and maybe it was or wasn't addressed. And that can get really frustrating for the other members of the group. So this is why process is important. Being able to focus on process, basically the way a group makes a decision, the way a group is relating, the members are relating to each other. And we've talked about process in our in-class weekend retreat. This is important because we're looking at the way people communicate, participate, fight, plan, coordinate, learn from their mistakes, and accomplish goals in groups. And when we look at process, it can help us figure out why are we struggling in the way that we're communicating and relating to one another, and how can we address it and move forward in our group. So interventions that we're going to talk about, basically we're going to define intervention as any action initiated in hopes of creating a more positive way for a group to interact. So these are process-oriented interventions. They're also defined by outcomes an intervention can create. Group leaders can choose between interventions directed at either individuals or to a whole group, and they can have very different or similar effects depending on how and when they're used. And group leaders must consider how to relate interventions to the group's experience in relevant and meaningful ways. And so examples are a group leader asking one group member, "It seems like you're having a pretty rough day. What's up?" Asking this question to someone that seems like they might be a little checked out in a group, or seems distracted, or is acting out towards other people, especially if you're working with kids. This would be an individual-oriented intervention. So thinking about what could be useful about it and what might not be useful about the intervention. So, in giving you a minute to think about that, it might be useful in the sense that it would target this person. It might get them to engage more into the group dynamic. It might also be calling a person out that feels uncomfortable being put on the spot, and has the effect of having them withdraw even more from the group. So it's important to keep in mind, who are you using it on? Why are you choosing this specific type of intervention? And how do you think it'll affect not only them, but also the whole group dynamic? So to contrast that, a group leader says to the whole group, "It seems like people are having a rough day. What's going on?" What might be the pros and cons to this approach? You're addressing the whole group, although it does reduce accountability, so someone might decide to speak up and say something, or everybody might just stay quiet. It depends on the group. A good example of this is on Sunday when we met in person for our in-person weekend retreat. I think I started the class by saying, like, "Hey, how are we feeling? Let's throw out some words. What's going on?" Or later in the day, I think I even offered an observation of, "Oh, it seems like the energy is low. How are people feeling?" That would be an intervention that I'm addressing to the whole group. If I'm noticing energy is low and participation and engagement is low, I can decide to use a group level intervention and make a comment. Even just making a comment, an observation comment, is considered an intervention because it's doing something in an attempt to change the way the group is functioning. And so sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't, and it'll depend on how it's delivered, who's in the group, at what time, all of these things. And it takes practice to be able to get them to stick, and they won't always stick. So that's also important to know. I think when I posed that question, um, there was silence for a while, and I think some people may have said, "We're tired, it's been a long day." And that gave me, as the facilitator in this class group, some more information about how people are feeling, which can then help me tailor my teaching style to either try to infuse more energy into the group or just meet you where you're at and shift to less demanding activities. And I can make that decision after I have that information. So, generally, you want to invite group participation. So the way that you do that, to have the group participate with one another, to have members talk to each other, is you want to ask the group content questions. You can also ask the group dynamics questions. And so content, again, when we think about content, you might ask about an assignment from last week or a skill that you're working on. That's content. That's things that you're working on in the group or teaching in the group. Depends on the kind of group. You can also ask the group dynamics questions, and that's more process stuff. How are we feeling? How do we think we're doing as a group? How do you think we're performing? What do you think we might still be struggling with? Those are dynamics questions. And to the extent that it's appropriate, you can use individual or dyadic interventions. Dyadic means two. So individual, you can single out one person and talk directly to them, or you can invite them to talk in pairs, and that would be dyadic interventions. And then from there, you can move on to more group interventions. So one thing that I tend to like, and I may or may not use this in our next weekend class, is something called Think, Pair, Share. And basically, this poses a question to the group and initially asks them to reflect on the question. Maybe write some things down. Give them a couple minutes to think on it silently. Reflect on it. That's the think part. And then after a few minutes have passed and they have some time to collect their thoughts, they can pair up. So turn to the person next to you and share what some of your thoughts were. That's the pair in Think, Pair, Share. And then after a few minutes have passed with that, you can come back to the larger group and invite some people to share what their partner said. And then that's the share part. And the reason Think, Pair, Share is such a great tool and intervention to use is because it caters to very different processing styles. Some people are very much processors. They think about things as they talk about them with someone else. Some people need to pause and collect their thoughts before speaking out loud to another person. And this allows for both of those different styles. And then because you're asking them to share about their partner, you want to be careful that you're not asking too sensitive information, or ask them to check in with their partner to make sure it's okay to share with a larger group. But it also takes some of the onus off of them sharing their own very vulnerable information, or sharing just about themselves can be vulnerable, whether it's sensitive or not. And so that's why they're sharing about their partner. So that's Think, Pair, Share. You also do want to aim for witnessing, joining, empathizing, and highlighting similar and different points of view. And hopefully you've learned about these things in group and individual interventions 1. Basically, witnessing is when someone just listens to something difficult that a person is sharing. And that process of having someone witness you tell your story can be very therapeutic. Joining is when you and another person or a whole group is aligning on an issue or sharing the same experience. They're coming together and forming bonds and stronger bonds. And then there's also empathizing, where someone is really identifying and connecting to what another person is sharing, being able to recognize, I know what that feeling is, or I can imagine what that feeling is, and now I feel it too, and I can really empathize with what you're feeling. And then, similar different points of view, pretty self-explanatory. Um, don't give a lot of advice. As a first-time group facilitator, it can be very attractive to get into the role of advice giving or offer suggestions, or you see someone struggling and you're all, I imagine, very empathic beings. And so seeing someone struggle is hard, and wanting to jump in and say, hey, here's something that you can do, and to offer a solution makes sense, and it's not necessarily the most therapeutic thing to do. Because ultimately, when you offer advice and suggestions, you're offering advice and suggestions from your point of view and what would work for you. Those things may not necessarily be the best options or work for the person that is speaking to you, because they're a different person. And so it can be more helpful to help explore different options for them, help them generate ideas, help them generate solutions, think about pros and cons, things like that. So you would then be more of a facilitator or guide as opposed to advice giver. So here's an example. So Anita's having a hard time managing her mom's tendency to tell her how she should be raising her kids. So in this scenario, you think about having a parent group talking about parenting, and Anita is a mom, and she is having a hard time because her own mom is trying to tell her how she should be raising her kids. And so you've just provided this summary statement for the whole group. Something you could try there is, have others had similar experiences? This would offer the opportunity for empathy, for joining around these similar experiences, for normalizing the struggle that she's having, and probably to validate her experience, that others would say, wow, yeah, that feels really hard, or yeah, I've actually had that experience too with my mother-in-law or with my dad, or things like that. And that would join, provide empathy, and normalize and validate her experience. All of those things, just by that, asking that question. However, if you instead offer something like, what do you think she should do? Shoulds are typically something that you want to steer clear of, basically because shoulds imply shame and judgment, and as though like they already did something wrong or already didn't do something right. And so we want to be aware of shoulds and reduce our usage of them. But when you ask that question, what do you think she should do, that invites all kinds of advice, or do this, do that, do this, which isn't necessarily helpful for her unless she's specifically saying, I'm stuck. What are some ways I might address this issue? If that's where she is, then a question like, what have others tried? If you've had that experience, might be helpful. But to try and elicit suggestions from people that may not necessarily have experienced what she's experiencing could be very invalidating and very shaming and be overwhelming for her in this moment. So some words of wisdom. If one intervention does achieve the desired outcome, doesn't achieve the desired outcome, you can keep trying things out. So that should be doesn't there. What works with one group may not work for another group, and what works at one stage in the group development may not work at another stage of group development. So again, like timing is super important, and who's in the group is super important, and your style. And all of these things kind of come together. And so if something doesn't work the first time, that's okay. They won't always work. Practice also helps. They likely won't work perfectly the first time you do them. And they also likely won't come out very naturally feeling or fluid in how they feel when you try out an intervention and it comes out of your mouth. Always begin with a gentle intervention. That just helps build your own self-efficacy, which is just your sense of being able to do something successfully. So that helps build that up for yourself, and that helps build up your own confidence in your own skills. And confidence will also then lead to more fluidity and more natural interventions. So start small. Areas where you can intervene. Using the agenda for your group, so being very proactive about how you set up that week's agenda, through gathering and sharing data or observations, and through coaching. So these are 3 areas where you can intervene. I would write those down. So the agenda, that's the game plan. You want to try developing agendas to keep people on track and to include questions that attend to interpersonal issues that may be affecting the effectiveness of the group. So having a balanced agenda that is engaging, that has exciting content, that keeps people engaged, interesting information, but that also attends to the process, the interpersonal issues that might come up and affect the way the group is performing. Asking questions that start with how and what, not why. So examples, like what problems or concerns are you having in your position right now? What factors are hindering your ability to accomplish your job? How can we work through conflict that is hurting our group right now? What motivates you? What decreases your motivation? Those are all examples of how and what questions. And the reason we want to use those is because it invites more reflection, it invites more discussion. Why can sound a bit blaming. So why did you wait until now to come to group therapy? Another way you can phrase that is, what's going on that led you to come now? It's very different. Same question, but why can sound a bit more blaming. So you want to incorporate regular process analysis or check-ins. You've noticed that I've also done this in our weekend class. Just to check in of how is the energy level? How are we doing? How is the agenda working for us so far? And being flexible, being able to shift gears if needed. Have meetings, agendas that are devoted solely to interpersonal process. So having discussions built in where you talk about role expectations, interpersonal styles, preferences on giving and receiving feedback. So very important, especially in certain types of groups like parenting groups. How they want to give and receive feedback if you're doing role plays, for example, might be really important because doing role plays can be very vulnerable for parents, especially with the topic of parenting. You also want to incorporate psychoeducational discussion on conflict resolution and communication. And what I mean by psychoeducational discussion is essentially where you, that gives a little bit more of a lecture-y feel, but you want to keep it very brief. So you're providing information, you're teaching a little bit. So around conflict resolution and communication, you would be providing some guided discussion on things that you know as people that have studied conflict resolution and communication. What makes for positive conflict resolution and healthy communication? And it can still be a discussion. You can elicit ideas from the group, and you also want to highlight the things that are also proven in the research that contribute to healthy conflict resolution and communication. And so we talked about the agenda. Now gathering and sharing data or observations can also be used as an intervention. Sending out questionnaires or having people respond to a topic of concern. One thing which I gathered data during our weekend class was doing gots and needs, where I had you write down one thing that you got and one thing that you still need from me. or need from the class. And that was my way of gathering data on your experiences in this group. Individually interview members about a topic of concern or about the general operation of the group. Sometimes that's just built into the curriculum of a group where you meet individually with each member at the beginning. So you can establish rapport, so you can talk about role expectations, and also, as if it overlaps with the storming phase, you can talk about some of the concerns that are coming up. You can also have a process observer, so someone that's not a member of the group, just come in and observe your group and then give feedback to the whole group at the end of the meeting. For my own program, I have had to have someone from the teaching effectiveness program come in as an outside observer and sit in on my class and observe the dynamics in my class so that he can then give me feedback on my teaching style and what he observed as the pros and cons of my own teaching to help me improve. That's something that everyone in my program has to go through. So it wasn't because there was a concern or anything, but having a process observer can provide some really useful information and can give you a different perspective that maybe your students may not even be able to provide you with if you ask them for feedback. It would be a different kind of feedback. You can also set aside a separate time to give feedback to individuals about their behavior in a group. And this one I don't see you really needing to use in the types of groups that you would be involved with. One-on-one feedback, especially from the facilitator to the group members, for you to give them feedback can be a bit, it would highlight the power dynamic and differential. And for your groups, typically what is best is if you downplay that power differential and allow the group to kind of run itself for a lot of the groups that you might be doing. And so that one I wouldn't necessarily recommend, but know that it's there. It would just work better in some groups over others. You also can increase the amount of immediate feedback to individuals after meetings regarding their behavior. You can also share written material with members of the group to increase their understanding of a concept that would help them become more effective. So doing some assigned reading, to reading about the effectiveness of praise and validation. Again, going with the parenting skills. Have them read a short article or a short excerpt from something that talks about why it's important to use the skill and how we do it. Have other members give feedback to the individual on how inappropriate behavior affects them. And that can be particularly useful while scary to do as the group facilitator if you're having a group member causing issues in terms of process and interpersonal dynamics, to actually invite giving them feedback to one another so that you're not the one giving feedback, but you can facilitate group members giving feedback to one another. Coaching and counseling is another place for intervention. You can set up individual meetings with your group members to help develop plans, share information, create strategies, and enhance personal skills. Works best when set up as the norm at the onset of the group. So if that's the expectation at the beginning of the group, all right, over the course of these 10 weeks, you will have one meeting, one coaching session with me where we'll talk one-on-one about your progress and where you feel like you still need more support and things like that. Use the recommend and if approved act concept. And so thinking about that is if someone's talking about an issue, you could intervene by saying, well, let's pretend that everything you just told me, your friend just told you. What would you recommend to that friend? And they might say some things. And if you hear a good one that you think might be a good option to explore, then explore it. So talk about, okay, so that sounds like something that we might want to explore. What would happen if you did do that or if your friend did that? What might be the potential outcome or consequences? And then if it sounds like those are realistic and reasonable, and would work, then you can support action for that person. It's like, all right, maybe try that out and then report back how that went, something like that. You can also hold up a mirror of their actions to get their reaction, and that's very tricky to do. It takes practice to do without judgment, but that would involve something along the lines of reflecting back what they're saying in a way that is meant to highlight um, some problematic behavior, but in a very gentle way. Like, okay, so what I'm hearing you say is that right now you are engaging in this behavior. Um, and it's like in a more objective way of reframing what they're saying in order to elicit a response. And then you can also have an individual actively observe or work with another group member to see how they do things. You can also balance the amount of challenge and support. That's very important. You want to push your group members to grow, but you also want to be very supportive. Use communication, counseling, and rapport building skills to decrease defensiveness as you challenge your clients or group members. And you could create a pinch in the environment. And that's basically where you are stimulating, you're actually eliciting some discomfort in the group and in the group member, highlighting um, tension or confrontation that might be like an undercurrent in the way groups are relating to one another, and really bring it up to the forefront so that people can talk about it. You want to practice, and if you're going to make mistakes, so I'm going to say that right off the bat. You're going to make mistakes, and that's okay. Learn from them. Don't get stuck in them, even though that's really easy to do, and try again. So when something doesn't go well, thinking through, okay, what happened here? What didn't go well? What might I choose to do differently next time? Or do I want to choose a completely different intervention next time? Because this one maybe doesn't fit with my style. And that's all just good information and will help you improve. You also want to think about how often should we intervene and when should we intervene to be most effective. So there's another three types of interventions: conceptual input, coaching, and process observation. There are three different types of interventions, and things that you want to consider for them. The objective that it can facilitate. So what are you trying to do with this intervention? What might it look like or sound like when we make it? When might we make it? And then the form or style that it might take. So we're going to talk about these a little bit more. So conceptual input interventions, the objective is that it provides group members with an organizing principle and has the power to help them clearly see distinctions between typical behavior and less traditional behavior. These are good because group members tend to remember the concepts and you can refer back to them as needed. So this would be something where you've already done some psychoeducation around a particular skill, around a particular concept. You've already talked about, let's say, praise and validation or effective communication and conflict resolution skills. You can refer back to them if you start seeing some issues come up in the way group members are communicating or resolving conflict. You can actually invite them to say, hey, remember when we talked about this concept earlier? Let's try to keep that in mind, and how can we practice that right now in what we're experiencing in the group? You can use at any time. For the maximum effect and impact, you should use it, not should, you can use it immediately after a non-productive behavior. And the form and style would be brief and succinct. You do not want to talk over your group or use vocabulary that they wouldn't understand or relate to. So you want to make sure that you are using vocab that is relatable and understandable for your group members. So make sure it's something that you've already defined and talked about in depth if you're going to be using those terms. And so you want to keep it short and brief and let them take it from there and see what happens. So step in and then step back. coaching and interventions. So for this, you're basically assisting members of a group to get in the habit of using new behaviors that they have said they want to practice. So you're using what they've already said is one of their goals. It should help group members acquire desirable functional habits in the way that they interact with people. So reminding them of what their goals are, encouragement, and assisting them to practice that new skill that they want to work on. Oftentimes that might just be like a very short and gentle reminder. So the timing, early stages of group formation to help shape the kind and sequence of interaction at any early point. You want to discontinue coaching as soon as they don't need it, or when another member starts coaching. The reason for that is you don't want the group to become over-reliant on the leader. You want them to be able to just acquire these new skills and be able to think of it on their own and practice on their own without your reminder, because you won't be there all the time and you're not there all the time, so that they can also remember to practice these skills when you're not around and when they're not in the group. So the form and style, relatedly, should use up very little airtime. They should be, sorry for the shoulds, they can be suggestions rather than demands or reprimands, and can be precise and understandable. And this is an important one. People shouldn't have to guess what the group leader is aiming at. So you want to be direct and brief and clear in what you're saying. Process observation interventions. Ooh, sorry, these are some typos. The objective, heightening the group members' awareness between the content and process dimensions of the activities occurring within the group. You also want to heighten the group awareness of the implications and consequences of its members' actions. One member's behavior can set norms for all members' behavior, as well as norms for group dynamics. One example of this is interruptions. If interruptions become kind of the norm, if one group member keeps interrupting, you might notice that then that's kind of the norm, and then group members just start interrupting one another. And so being able to provide a process observation intervention, like, hey, I'm noticing that people are interrupting one another, and is this something that we want to continue doing? How is this functioning within our group? And is this something that we want to change? And so inviting discussion around the observation that you made and offered. And then also providing an observable model of functional behavior that demonstrates in a tangible manner how a group's movement in the direction of its objectives can be facilitated. So modeling what functional behavior is, and also making that connection between how the different behavior can affect group performance and the way that they relate to one another and the way that they all make progress together. Timing for the process observational intervention. It's most effective during the early phase of group process when a leader has modeled a process observation, modeling like, hey, I'm noticing that people are interrupting one another. So modeling that, they should refrain from doing it again. So waiting before you do it again to see if other members jump in and start to do that instead of you, and that would be preferred, so that other members can practice facilitative functions. If group members do not start doing this for themselves, then you might gather data on outcomes and consequences. You might present it to the group and ask, like, what, if anything, do you all want to do about this situation? They might decide that actually it's not a big deal and we like being able to talk over one another, interrupt, and maybe that just becomes a group norm. So it's also meeting your group members where they're at, not assuming that you necessarily know what's best, because it's going to vary person to person and group to group. Form and style. You want to be personalized and not punitive. Usually takes a bit longer than others to do this kind of information because you want to elicit conversation. And you also want to draw a verbal portrait of the dynamic group process. So paint a verbal picture of what's happening. I'm noticing that when these members speak, these other members seem to have a tendency to interrupt. I don't think that it's intentional or conscious, but I'm noticing that it's a pattern. How do we all feel about that? would be an example. Um, and then model the behavior for the group members in the example that I just gave would be a model of how to present a process observational intervention. Reminders: don't do for the group what the members can do for themselves. If they don't have the resources, then that's when it's a good sign for the leader to jump in and help. Too much assistance, like I said, leads to an over-reliance on the leader. And so you want to also pay attention to how much you're talking compared to the group members. And you want to elicit more group member discussion, and you want to be able to back off, especially as you progress through the stages of group development. Common pitfalls: intervening too often, also intervening too infrequently, being too lengthy, so talking too much when you intervene, negative, not positive, and doing these things all could stifle group development. So important to track these things in addition to the several other things that you need to be tracking when you are facilitating a group. So that's the end of this lecture. Some things to look ahead for. Remember, log your hours this week for the assignment that I emailed you about. The CAFs can typically, of course this one is a bit different because it's a log instead of a question, but typically the CAFs can be short answer and they are not as involved as those for Kathy's classes, so it is less work for each one. I know that I have more of them than Kathy does, but treat them as like another foreign question. Also, next weekend is our weekend retreat. So that's week 7. There will not be video lectures or activities that week. Work on your group projects. The presentations will be on Sunday of that weekend retreat in the afternoon. Also know that Sunday during lunch, Kathy has scheduled you all for a large cohort meeting, and she is providing pizza. So know that if you don't mind eating pizza for lunch, then you have lunch provided. If you don't eat pizza, then still remember to bring your own lunch or money to buy, oh well, you won't have time to buy lunch, but you could buy lunch in the morning, and I can give you access to the fridge both days. Additionally, don't forget to bring snacks. Also, important distinction, I know that Kathy mentioned that she will often provide you with snacks. She gets reimbursed for snacks because she's faculty, and I do not because I'm a GTF. And so it's not that I am not providing you snacks because I'm cruel. It's that they don't reimburse me to do that, so I can't. So apologize for that. I had no idea that Kathy was providing you snacks. Um, Kathy brought that up to me, and so I wanted to convey that information to you. Also, there was some comment from the student reps about the guest speaker, Graham Turner, from our last weekend retreat, that what he was talking about wasn't all that relevant to early childhood education, and that was a bit confusing in terms of the feedback because it was a Q&A presentation. So he only spoke as long as you all had questions for him. So I hope that you didn't feel pressured to keep asking questions even though they weren't interesting. My hope is that you engage the speakers only for as long as it's relevant and engaging and interesting to you all. I understand there could be some individual differences in how relevant or how interesting someone is. So yeah, and then also just making the note about this class, even though it is early childhood education, group interventions that you're going to be doing within early childhood education are either going to be school-age children or most likely working with parents. And so the skills that I'm talking about, when I relate them back, I talk about you can do this with children, or I offer examples around parent training classes. And that is what I had Graham do as well. His experiences working with children, interacting with children, but then also interacting with parents. And some of the speakers and examples that I give in vignettes that I talk about or provide from my own experiences might be more on an individual level, But what I'm highlighting is typically an intervention that can then be applied to a group setting. And so I may not always have a perfect example of something to share with you about a group in a school or a group with parents. But I do have experiences that I'll draw from with adults, with parents, or with children that I've worked on individually, where what I'm discussing or what the guest lecturer is discussing is applicable to different kinds of groups. And so even though some of the experiences won't match up exactly with early childhood education, that's because early childhood education is a program within Family and Human Services. And so I'm presenting you with information and guest speakers that are relevant to Family and Human Services and that can be readily applied to early childhood education. And so part of that is I'll present this information. Part of it is also on you to be able to draw those connections too and ask questions if those connections aren't clear or you're having difficulty making them. And I can help with that. So just in preface before our second retreat, where I will likely have another guest speaker that may not talk specifically about early childhood education, but they will talk about group dynamics and facilitating groups. And these larger group concepts are then to be applied to your work, and we can discuss that. So that's it. That's all I had to say. Thank you for being patient for a slightly longer lecture. But you won't have one next week, so that's great. Just on the weekend with me. And I'll see you all next weekend.